Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to the channel. For those of you who probably missed it on Wednesday, I didn't record. I was traveling and getting ready to spend some time with family for Thanksgiving. So if anybody wants to comment about their Thanksgiving, just do so in the comments and, have fun with it. As always, likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help, and I greatly appreciate them. Any sort of interaction, sharing, you get the drill. Feed the algorithm and help the channel reach 1,000 by the end of the year. We'll see if that's possible. If we average about 2 subscribers a day, yeah, actually it is. So, we're there. We're almost there. We're almost there. Anyway, what I wanted to do today, considering that there's been some rather wacky polling going on for some people looking at the midterms, was instead of looking at the midterms, looking at 2024 and what each party could expect based off of various presidential level margins, right? And, well, we're going to start with a baseline. Now, this is based off of my partisanship measure. So it's not necessarily going to line up with other people's partisan indexes or indices. But this is based off of mine, which figures where states should vote if the election were a 50-50 election, where both parties got the same vote share nationally, and tries to take various functions out of the equation. Now, Delaware and New York, I think, are actually both skewed by the home state effect from last election, because those produced massive swings that in partisanship that I don't think could be explained by any other measure. For example, Delaware swung way further towards the Democrats than it should have based off of the national result and its partisan and its trends. Actually, it should have continued to move to the right if that were the case. New York actually was one of those states that swung slightly towards Donald Trump, and like I said, I think that can be reasonably explained by home state advantage. So take both New York and Delaware with a grain of salt. You can also throw Indiana and California into that mix with the vice president's home state advantage built in. And just pouring over the numbers that I've collected so far, yeah. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wait till after the midterms to actually start using my model again. That's why I haven't been doing updates of it at all. Is because, number one, it became pretty time consuming, especially with the new job and all that stuff. And also, I think we're not getting really useful data at this point regarding 2024. So I'm going to wait till after the midterms to start collecting that data. But the second the midterms happen, oh yeah, you bet I'm going to be crunching the numbers. So anyway, we're going to start by going in increments of 5, 10, and 15% for national margin. And we're going to start on the Democratic side. So what would a 5-point Democratic victory look like? Well, based purely on the partisanship of each state, as well as myself guesstimating the guesstimating how elastic a state is. Basically, that's how much a state moves relative to a shift in the national margins. So states in the Northeast, with one or two exceptions, New York, as well as the Midwest. Again, Illinois is a sort of exception. Those tend to be more elastic, meaning they actually move more relative to the nation than you might expect if you were just apply a shift the same across the board, which is not the best way to do it. Whereas states typically in the Deep South tend to not be elastic at all. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, it's Arkansas or Alabama were one of those two was the least elastic state in the nation. Mississippi was in the running too, and all of those were under a half point expected shift for every percent nationally. So I kind of just guesstimated based off of that and local knowledge, as well as of quite a few of these areas, particularly in the South, but also with expected population shifts and all that stuff. I did give some states a little bit different figures. For example, Georgia is going to move a little bit more relative to the nation than it used to, is a good example. A 5-point Democratic victory, well, this is basically what we saw last year in 2020. And you're going to be asking, why didn't I include Nebraska's second or Maine's second? And that's because I'm not bothering with state splits right now, even though we actually do finally know what those districts are going to look like, and they're relatively the same as the old districts. But I just wanted to, be fair and not factor those in. Anyway, so yeah, this is pretty much the exact same map as 2020, and I don't think anybody's going to complain. Exception would be Texas is a little bit different in that it's closer, it's within 5%. By the way, for me, tilt, when I'm talking about using it for margins, tilt is going to be 5%. Lean is going to be 10% and less, 5 to 10%, and likely is going to be 10 to 15. So 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Pretty simple, and safe as anything greater than 15. When I'm doing forecasts, the colors are just a sign of my confidence. The darker it is, the more confident I am. Okay? But for this, we're talking about percentages, and this is about where I think most people would expect. And notice Nebraska's there. When we get to 10%, that's where things start to snowball, right? And if you're beating your opponent by 10%, you're not just winning by driving up the margins in your areas. You are actually really starting to convince those on the fence or soft voters who don't turn out, as well as maybe or soft voters who turn out for your opponent but are like, you're convincing them to say, no, actually, I'm going to vote for you now. You're also maybe getting some depressed turnout from the side that is knowing that they're getting their rear ends handed to them. So that also explains why things will move a lot more the bigger the blowout gets. And yeah, this would be a landslide, and it would be, I think, the biggest margin of victory in a presidential election since 2008. Certainly 2008. And yeah, obviously North Carolina and Florida finally go for the Democrats in this scenario. Iowa, Ohio, and Texas are darn close, and so would be Alaska. You'd start seeing movement in quite a few places. South Carolina would start moving and looking competitive, stuff like that. And of course, you see the resurrection of the blue wall with new member Virginia, as well as, I guess, new members Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada. Of course, the famous blue wall being 3 Pacific states: Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, as well as the entire Northeast minus New Hampshire. Then, this is a 15-point, and this would be probably the largest blowout you could expect. And there's kind of a reason why I don't think we'll see anything bigger than a 15-point win anytime soon, is I don't think we're in the right type of an environment for it. 70s and 80s, sure. 60s, sure. But once the 90s hit, things started becoming very divided, because in that time, both party centers they didn't overlap, but the left wing of the Republican Party, or, the most moderate Republicans, which was about a third of the party, overlapped with the most moderate Democrats, which was about a third of the party. And those were the ones who typically got elected in general elections. Both party centers were closer together, and therefore both parties had a lot of overlap, and that made, whoever was able to play to that overlap the best, able to win large margins. Nowadays, it's much more about turning out your base and making sure that you convince the few moderates that are left that you are more moderate than the other person. So, yeah. Obviously here, you finally get to see the flips of Ohio, Iowa, Texas. That leads to this blowout being 415. Now, if we go back to the original map, one thing that I noticed was that well over half of the Democrats' electoral base or electoral votes are from safe states. And that's not just interesting, but it kind of shows that the Democrats are really only in a strong position electorally because they're able to win a lot of, quite a few of the very, very large states, California and New York. And they're doing very well in other states like Washington, which is not small, Maryland, Massachusetts, states like that produce a ton of electoral votes. Illinois, too, for example. But once you get into competitive races, like in Minnesota and Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, not really Colorado these days, but once you start looking at the competitive states, you realize that the Democrats are really on shaky footing, and that even if a state votes more to the right, or that even if the Democrats win a state, it's only because they were able to win nationally by such a by a larger margin. For example, 2000, we saw quite a few states that, even though they voted Democrats, for the Democrats, actually were closer to going Republican than the popular vote. And the same thing actually applies in 2016 and, of course, 2020. If we actually look at it, find states with margins of victory for Biden that had a closer margin than the nation, you'll realize Democrats don't really do well in these competitive states relative to how their vote totals add up from large, very urban, populous areas. Now, you could say that's a problem with the Electoral College system. You're free to do that. But it's the system we have, and there's no real back door. People will say, what about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact? Well, yeah, the second that it goes into effect, you're going to have a lot of fights in court over that. It's going to go before the Supreme Court. And, well, there's a few ways the Supreme Court could rule. They could say, technically it is constitutional, but it also flies in the face of what was intended by the Constitution, by the communications of the founders, as well as what it meant constitutionally, right? Or what the goal, what the understanding of the Constitution was back in the founding. Technically, yeah, a state can say, you know what, we're not awarding our electoral votes to the winner of the election in our state. We're going to award them to the popular vote winner. But there's also going to be problems within the state, whether or not it's kosher with the state constitution. Let's say, I don't know, hypothetically, let's go with Virginia. Let's say Virginia had signed on, right? And it had gone into effect, and Virginia's population votes for a Democrat, but the nation as a whole votes for a Republican. Do you think the Democrats in Virginia are going to want to award the Electoral College votes to the Republican? And of course, it goes the other way around, too. So there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of moving parts, and there's the question of, is it constitutional? That I don't even think constitutional scholars know what the Supreme Court would do with that case. So, anyway. Moving on to Republicans now. This would be a 5% victory. And for anybody who's asking what the hell about New Jersey and them, well, it's hard to explain. If you want to look up my video explaining how I do the partisanships, there's a very good reason why my model does not, or my partisanship index does not consider them to be safe. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they don't actually vote that much more Democratic than the nation as a whole, which is what my partisanship index is based off of. Anyway, a Republican 5-point win, well, this is exactly what I mean. There's a lot of Democratic states that are only just barely safe or aren't safe at all, and that the truly safe states for Democrats are California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont. Everything else could fall with a big enough victory in the right national environment. Republicans can pretty much reliably count on most of the states that vote for them. Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, hell, even Kansas, even though that's becoming less of a sure thing. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina. And it still adds up to basically 123, which if we go to our original, only 6 extra votes are safe than the Republicans get in the worst case blowout scenario. They only lose 6 from the safe states. And that's kind of telling, and those 6 are Iowa, just because Iowa has shifted that far to the right, and on top of all that, is also pretty elastic. Democrats, yeah, they keep most of their original 135 as safe, but they kind of get hosed because Michigan falls. What was it? Yeah. Because, yeah, from the original, Michigan would fall, Minnesota would fall, Maine and New Hampshire would fall. And sure, that may not sound like a gigantic amount, and it really isn't. But look at the states that could fall if things break exactly right for the Republicans. You could throw in New Mexico and Virginia. You could honestly even consider saying, okay, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Rhode Island might be more competitive than we're giving it credit for. And that can all play into everything. We go to a 10-point blowout, and you really could say, yeah, By the way, I think actually in reality, Delaware would go before New Jersey. It's just the way partisanship has worked out in the way I do my partisanship index that leads it. And like I said, home state advantage really affects things. Same thing with New York. I think it'd still be safe, but in this scenario, but just barely. But I'm trying to keep it based off of the math that I've done and the work that I've done. I'd rather not, break from it and say, okay, this is a little bit insane. But yeah, so yeah, it's pretty bad at 10%. This is, I think, a bigger margin than the Democrats' 10%. Yeah, exactly. Republicans' 5% was better, and the Republicans' 10% is better than the Democrats. And that, again, has to do with the fact that Republicans are much closer in more competitive races, and there's more of them than the Democrats are in safe Republican areas or not entirely competitive Republican states. And if we move to the 15%, Republicans, I think, are actually even with the Democrats. The 2 electoral votes missing, and honestly, you can make a decent argument for Washington also falling. But yeah, both parties, if they were to actually rack up a 15% win nationally, would cross the 400 electoral vote barrier for the first time in a very, very long time. I don't think anybody's crossed 400 since H.W. Bush in 88. So that'd be pretty interesting to see. And it, like I said, it would take an actual blowout for that to happen. I dread to think what a Reagan-like victory would look like. When I say a Reagan-like victory, I'm talking 84, or we could even throw in Nixon in 72 type of victory. I dread to think what that would look like for either party. They would just be a bloodbath. But as you can see, Oregon would flip, Colorado would flip, Illinois, the entire, southern New England, so Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware would flip. As I said, also pay attention to the Deep South. They're not nearly as elastic as some of these other states, which is why you'll see more movement in this area. You'll see more movement kind of in this area than you will down here. Nevada is, I'd argue, actually probably the new king for inelastic states. And that's because they had basically the same margin in 2020 as they did in 2016, despite about a 2% difference in the national popular vote. And Nevada was still, same margin. And turnout was dramatically increased too, so yeah. Basically, both parties can actually realistically achieve some pretty big blowouts, or not realistically, but if both parties could get a big blowout, they have a realistic shot at 400 electoral votes. 500, I don't actually think is possible these days. We need a lot of things to change in order for that to be the case, and I don't see it happening within the decade, so maybe we'll be talking about a scenario where 500 electoral votes is possible in 2030 when we're gearing up for the 32 elections. But anyway, that's going to be it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here, and I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy.